The mountain man knocked and said, "I was told you're alone. Let me give you sons, woman." The words echoed through the valley, carrying weight beyond their simple syllables. This encounter would change everything for a woman isolated in a place where traditions ran as deep as the mountain roots. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rope cut deep into Mary Johnson's wrists, burning colder than the wind that howled around her. Each step through the knee-deep snow sent fresh waves of pain shooting up her arms, but she dared not cry out. The last time she had shown weakness, Robert Davis had struck her across the face, his wedding ring leaving a cut that still stung beneath the freezing air. "Keep moving," Robert growled, yanking the rope forward. Her brother-in-law's breath formed clouds in the frigid Colorado air, the stench of whiskey and triumph mingling as he hauled her higher into the mountains. The weight of his betrayal was heavier than the snow clinging to her threadbare dress. "Please," Mary whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "The land was Thomas's gift to me. You know that." Robert turned, his face twisted with contempt. "A barren woman has no right to good land. The town decided." He spat into the snow. "You should be grateful. Most wanted you hanged after what happened." Mary fell silent. The accusations had been lies, all of them, but truth meant nothing when greed took hold. They had branded her wrist with an iron heated in the church fireplace, the preacher's prayers drowning out her screams. The mark still throbbed beneath her tattered sleeve, a permanent reminder of how quickly neighbors could become monsters. The path grew steeper as they climbed into the shadow of the Rockies. Pine trees groaned under heavy snow, branches bending like mourners at a funeral. Mary stumbled, her strength fading. She had not eaten in 2 days, not since the town council had dragged her from her home and stripped her of everything her late husband had built. "Almost there," Robert said, his voice suddenly hushed with something like fear. He glanced nervously at the darkening forest around them. "The wolf's territory begins here." Mary had heard the whispers. Everyone in town had. The mountain man who traded pelts for supplies but never spoke. The hermit who appeared and vanished like a ghost, leaving only footprints larger than any normal man's. Some said he communed with wolves. Others claimed he was more beast than human himself. "Your debt to me is paid when I hand you over," Robert explained, a cruel smile playing at his lips. He wanted a woman. Doesn't matter what kind. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. She was nothing now. Just currency in a transaction between men, a sacrifice to appease the wilderness. As the first flakes of a new snowstorm began to fall, she realized that her life in the town had ended, and whatever awaited her in these mountains would either be her salvation or her grave. The wolf was more legend than man to the townsfolk of the small Colorado settlement. They spoke of him in hushed tones around evening fires. A mountain ghost who appeared twice yearly to trade exquisite pelts for salt, ammunition, and the barest necessities before vanishing back into the wilderness. Some claimed he communed with the beasts of the forest. Others whispered he was half beast himself, driven to solitude by some unspeakable tragedy. Robert Davis dragged Mary Johnson through knee-deep snow, her bound wrists raw and bleeding. The journey had taken nearly 6 hours, climbing steadily into the embrace of the Rockies, where the air grew thin and the pines stood sentinel against the endless white. Mary's lungs burned with each labored breath, her tears freezing against her cheeks before they could fall. "Almost there," Robert muttered, yanking the rope when she stumbled. "Your new husband awaits." His laughter cut through the mountain silence, sharp and cruel. The cabin appeared suddenly through the swirling snow, a structure that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. Built of massive timber and gray stone, it huddled against the elements like a wounded bear, defiant and immovable. Snow had drifted halfway up its northern wall, and icicles hung like fangs from the eaves. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of human presence in this desolate place. Robert halted at the edge of the small clearing, hesitation momentarily crossing his features before greed hardened his resolve. He pulled Mary forward, her exhausted legs barely supporting her weight as they approached the weathered door. "Stand straight," he hissed. "Make yourself useful, and he might keep you alive through winter." Robert's fist hammered against the thick wooden door, the sound swallowed by the vastness around them. For several moments, nothing happened. The wilderness held its breath. Mary prayed silently that no one would answer, that perhaps the myth was just that, a story to frighten children. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. The door swung inward without a creak, revealing John Smith, the wolf of the mountain. He filled the doorframe completely, a giant wrapped in layers of animal furs, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides. His face was a map of hardship, deeply lined and weathered by years of mountain winters, with a thick beard streaked with premature gray. But it was his eyes that froze Mary's blood, pale blue like glacier ice, observing them with the detached curiosity of a predator assessing whether something was worth the effort to kill. Not a word passed his lips as he regarded the pair on his doorstep, his massive hand resting casually on the doorframe, fingers scarred and calloused from a lifetime of survival. John's gaze swept over Mary, then fixed on Robert. The silence stretched between them, thick as ice on a winter pond. The mountain man's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes, sharp as a wolf's, took in every detail of the scene before him. "The debt," Robert Davis grunted, shoving Mary Johnson forward with callous force. "Paid in full. She's barren, but she'll work." His voice carried the stench of triumph, a man who believed he'd successfully rid himself of an inconvenience while settling accounts. The trapper's eyes lingered on the raw brand scorched into Mary's wrist, a mark of ownership and shame that the townsfolk had inflicted upon her. Then his gaze traveled to the exhaustion hollowing her face, the silent dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. In that moment of scrutiny, Mary felt herself being assessed not as property but as a survivor. John nodded once, the gesture curt and final. No words passed his lips, yet the acceptance was clear. The transaction was complete. Robert dropped the rope that had bound Mary's wrists, letting it fall into the snow with a soft thud. A sneer twisted his features as he looked between the woman and the mountain man. "Good riddance to bad fortune," he muttered, backing away. "The land's mine now, fair and square." Mary watched her brother-in-law's retreating figure. The man who had betrayed her after her husband's death, who had fabricated lies about her character to claim what wasn't his. Each step he took into the swirling snow lifted a small measure of the weight from her shoulders. The cold bit through her threadbare clothes, but she remained still, uncertain of her place in this new arrangement. Was she to be a servant? Something worse? The stories about the wolf of the mountain had reached even her ears during her time in town. Robert's silhouette grew smaller against the white landscape until he vanished completely, swallowed by the wilderness. The mountain seemed to exhale around them, as if relieved to be rid of the intruder. Mary stood alone with the silent giant, abandoned at the edge of civilization, with a stranger who communicated more with his eyes than his voice. The cabin behind him offered shelter from the biting cold, but what waited inside remained unknown. She was left in the hush of the mountain, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the uncertain mercy of a man who lived beyond society's reach. The heavy wooden door groaned shut with finality, sealing out the howling mountain storm and the cruelty of the world that had branded Mary Johnson as worthless. Inside the cabin, a different kind of pressure descended, a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight, broken only by the defiant crackle and pop of a stubborn fire that cast long shadows across rough-hewn walls. John Smith's massive frame moved with surprising grace as he pointed wordlessly toward a three-legged stool positioned near the hearth. His eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, communicated what his voice did not. Sit. Mary's limbs responded before her mind fully processed the command, moving stiffly as though they belonged to someone else. The rope burns around her wrists throbbed in time with her heartbeat as she lowered herself onto the wooden seat. Her body trembled from cold, from fear, from exhaustion. She could no longer distinguish which. The mountain man disappeared into the shadows of the cabin's far corner, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. The trapper returned moments later, carrying several items gathered from hidden shelves. A dented metal basin, filled with steaming water that sent ghostly tendrils into the air. A clean rag that had seen better days but was meticulously folded. And a small clay jar, sealed with beeswax that, when opened, released the sharp, clean scent of pine mixed with something medicinal. He set these items on the floor beside her with the careful precision of a man accustomed to conserving movement. Mary watched his scarred hands, hands that could easily snap her neck, as they arranged the healing supplies with unexpected gentleness. The fire popped loudly, making her flinch. The wolf noticed, but made no comment. Instead, he knelt before her, his massive frame somehow making himself smaller, less threatening, as he reached for her injured wrists. Mary instinctively pulled back, pressing herself against the rough wood of the stool. For a moment, they existed in perfect stillness, the hunted and the hunter, though she was no longer certain which was which. He waited, patient as the mountain itself, until she slowly extended her arms, offering her wounds to the stranger who now owned her life. The brand that Robert Davis had seared into her flesh seemed to burn anew under John's steady gaze. Outside, the wind screamed like a woman in mourning, but inside this strange fortress of stone and timber, time seemed suspended between heartbeats as two broken souls faced each other across the divide of their separate silences. John Smith knelt before Mary Johnson, his massive frame somehow gentle as he positioned himself at her feet. His hands, calloused from years of trapping and survival in the harsh Colorado wilderness, moved with surprising steadiness as he began cleaning the raw brand on her wrist. The mountain man worked methodically, his weathered face revealing nothing as he tended to her wound. Mary flinched when the cloth first touched her skin. Every touch she had experienced in the past year had brought only pain. The rough handling by Robert, the cruel binding of the rope, the searing agony of the iron that marked her as less than human in the eyes of the town. But John's touch was different, clinical and impersonal, yet somehow careful. He cleaned the wound with the precision of someone who had mended countless injuries, perhaps his own, in this isolated cabin. "It will heal," he muttered, the gravel in his voice startling after so much silence. His blue eyes, cold as the mountain streams, briefly met hers before returning to his task. The trapper worked with the same efficiency he likely used when dressing game or repairing tools. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary pressure. This was the care of a man who fixed broken things not out of compassion, but necessity. Things that must function again to survive. Yet the gentleness of his touch belied his reputation as the fearsome wolf. When he finished, John wrapped her wrist in clean linen, his fingers never lingering longer than needed. He secured the bandage with a small wooden pin, then rose to his full height, towering over her like one of the pines that surrounded his mountain home. Without a word, he moved to the hearth and ladled steaming venison stew into a wooden bowl. The rich aroma filled the cabin, making Mary's stomach clench with hunger she had been trying to ignore. He placed the food in her trembling hands, then reached for something hanging near the door. The wolf pelt he draped over her shoulders was thick and surprisingly soft, the fur still glossy despite the animal's death. It carried the faint scent of pine smoke and mountain air, warming her instantly. Mary clutched the edges of the pelt, drawing it closer around her body as she stared at the man retreating to the other side of the fire. This simple act, food, warmth, medical care, was the first kindness she had known since her husband's death and her subsequent betrayal by Robert Davis. And it came from a man the townsfolk called Monster, a silent giant they feared enough to use as their punishment. John Smith took his place across the fire, settling onto a worn wooden stool that had seen decades of use. The mountain man picked up his hunting knife and a whetstone, placing them carefully in his lap. His scarred hands moved with practiced precision as he began sharpening the blade in slow, steady strokes. The sound filled the cabin, rhythmic, hypnotic. Like a heartbeat in the hush that enveloped them, Mary ate the venison stew slowly, savoring each mouthful. The warmth of the food seeped into her bones, thawing something deeper than flesh, a part of her spirit that had frozen during those terrible months after her husband's death, when Robert had orchestrated her downfall. She watched John from beneath lowered lashes, studying the way his large frame hunched slightly over his work. His hands fascinated her. They were weathered and marked by countless winters, yet they moved with surprising grace. Every gesture was shaped by necessity, not waste, the economy of movement belonging to someone who had learned that survival left no room for excess. The firelight caught the ridges of old scars that crisscrossed his knuckles, telling stories his lips never would. The wolf, as the townsfolk called him, seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the silence. Unlike the oppressive quiet that had followed Mary's shaming in town, the whispers that stopped when she entered rooms, the accusations that hung in the air, this silence felt different. It was a living thing, comfortable and undemanding. She finished her stew and set the wooden bowl aside. The cabin was sparse but functional. A bed against one wall, shelves lined with preserved foods and medicines, tools hanging from hooks, and pelts stacked in one corner. Nothing decorative, nothing without purpose. Except, Mary noticed, for a small carving half hidden on the mantel above the fireplace. John looked up, catching her gaze. For a moment, something shifted in his winter blue eyes, a flicker of awareness, perhaps even vulnerability. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic expression. He tested the knife's edge with his thumb, nodded once in satisfaction, and returned to his methodical work. Mary pulled the wolf pelt tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled like a living creature, but inside, the cabin stood firm against the elements. She realized with a start that for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt safe. Not happy, not whole, but protected from immediate harm. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had found sanctuary with a man the town considered more dangerous than the wilderness itself. Days passed with the rhythm of necessity, not comfort. Mary Johnson found herself settling into a pattern as stark and unadorned as the cabin itself. Each morning before dawn, John would rise silently, pulling on his heavy fur coat and gathering his hunting tools. He never announced his departure, simply nodding once in her direction before disappearing into the pale mountain light. The cabin stood alone against the wilderness, a single room dominated by the stone hearth that provided both warmth and sustenance. Mary tended the fire with careful precision, understanding now that each log represented hours of John's labor. She learned to bank the coals just so, preserving heat through the long hours of his absence. By midday, she had established her own rituals, mending the few garments she possessed, scrubbing the wooden floor until her hands reddened, and preparing what meager ingredients remained for the evening meal. The mountain man returned predictably at dusk, often with a rabbit or grouse slung over his broad shoulder, sometimes with larger game that would sustain them for days. They worked in tandem without discussion. While John skinned and dressed the day's catch outside, Mary would prepare the cooking pot. While she stewed the meat, he split logs with powerful, economical strokes of his axe. The sound became comforting, a steady rhythm that meant security, that meant another day of survival. The cabin held no photographs, no letters, no trinkets of sentiment. The walls were adorned only with the implements of survival: traps hanging from pegs, dried herbs suspended from the rafters, a rifle mounted above the door. Even the single shelf contained only practical items: jars of preserved food, bundles of kindling, and a worn whetstone. Mary found herself studying John's movements when he thought she wasn't looking. His hands, though massive and scarred, moved with surprising gentleness when treating pelts or repairing traps. His face remained impassive, but his eyes, those winter blue eyes, sometimes drifted to the empty corners of the cabin, as if seeing ghosts. One evening, as she stirred a pot of rabbit stew, Mary noticed a small section of wall behind the woodpile, where the logs had been sanded unusually smooth. Running her fingers across it, she felt faint grooves, names that had been carved and then deliberately worn away. She pulled her hand back quickly when John entered, but something in his expression told her he knew what she'd discovered. That night, as snow pelted the windows and wind howled through the pines, Mary understood that the cabin's barrenness wasn't just simplicity, it was erasure. The trapper had built not just a shelter, but a fortress against memory itself. Over the weeks, Mary Johnson learned to decipher John's silent language, a code built on necessity rather than words. When she found a log deliberately placed by the cabin door, she understood firewood was running low. A filled water bucket left near the hearth was his wordless expression of gratitude for her cooking. Their communication evolved through these quiet signals, creating a rhythm as natural as the mountain's seasons. John never spoke. Not a single word had passed his lips since that first night. Mary found unexpected comfort in this silence. Back in town, words had been twisted against her, accusations flying like arrows after her husband's death. Robert Davis had manipulated testimonies, turning neighbors into enemies with poisonous whispers. Here, in this remote cabin, silence wasn't the punishment she'd initially feared. It was sanctuary. The mountain man moved with purpose, each gesture economical and precise. He taught her to skin rabbits without instruction, simply by allowing her to observe his weathered hands at work. She learned to read the weather in his movements. When he stacked extra wood or secured the shutters, a storm was approaching. Mary began anticipating his needs, leaving a clean cloth ready when he returned from hunting, or keeping stew warm when he worked late setting traps. Their routine became a dance neither had choreographed, but both understood perfectly. One night, a fierce blizzard descended upon the mountain. The wind howled like a wounded animal, finding every crack in the cabin's sturdy walls. Snow piled against the windows, and despite the fire's valiant efforts, bitter cold invaded their shelter. Mary sat near the hearth, shivering in her thin shawl, the only possession Robert had allowed her to keep. John glanced up from his work. He was repairing a snowshoe with careful, methodical movements. He observed her trembling form for a moment, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Without hesitation, he rose from his stool, crossed the wooden floor with heavy steps, and removed his thick fur cloak from its peg. The trapper draped the heavy garment over Mary's shoulders, his calloused fingers briefly brushing against her collarbone. The cloak carried his scent, pine, smoke, and something uniquely him. It enveloped her completely, still warm from his body. Mary looked up, startled by this unexpected kindness. The fur was luxurious against her skin, a protection against more than just the cold. Their eyes met across the small space, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement that perhaps they were no longer merely two solitary survivors sharing shelter, but something more. Mary's hands froze mid-motion as the heavy fur cloak settled around her shoulders. The weight of it was substantial, carrying not just warmth, but the scent of pine, smoke, and something uniquely John, the wilderness itself, captured in wool and hide. She opened her mouth to object, to insist he take it back, but the protest died on her lips when she looked up at him. John Smith stood there, his massive frame silhouetted against the firelight, shoulders still broad and imposing even without the cloak that had become part of his identity in her mind. The mountain man's face, usually as impassive as the granite peaks outside, had softened almost imperceptibly. In that brief moment, something changed in his winter blue eyes, a thaw, however slight. "You were cold," he said. His voice startled her more than his gesture. Rough as gravel, deep as the mountain ravines, it seemed to scrape against the silence that had ruled their existence. 3 simple words, yet they hung in the air between them, monumental in their ordinariness. Mary clutched the edges of the fur, suddenly aware of how desperately her body had craved warmth. The cabin, for all its shelter, remained at the mercy of Colorado's brutal winter. The blizzard outside rattled the wooden shutters like angry fists demanding entry. "Thank you," she whispered, her own voice strange to her ears after so many days of silence. The trapper nodded once, then returned to his work, his scarred hands resuming their task of mending a snare with practiced efficiency. But something fundamental had shifted. In that world of necessary silence, where words had become luxuries neither could afford, his small act of speech felt like a confession, an acknowledgement that she was more than just a burden thrust upon him by Robert Davis's cruelty. Mary pulled the cloak tighter, allowing herself to sink into its protection. The brand on her wrist throbbed dully, a permanent reminder of the town's judgment. Yet here in this single-room cabin perched against the wilderness, she realized she was truly seen for the first time since her husband's death. Not as property to be claimed, not as a debt to be paid, not as a barren woman without value, but as a human being, deserving of the simple dignity of warmth. She watched John's profile as he worked, wondering about the ghosts that haunted him. What sorrows had driven him to this solitary existence? The blizzard howled outside, but inside, something fragile and unnamed began to take root between 2 souls cast out by the world below. The morning after John had spoken those 3 precious words, Mary noticed something different on the rough-hewn table. A blue jay's feather, its vibrant azure catching the early light streaming through the cabin's single window. She picked it up, turning it between her fingers, feeling its delicate structure. She said nothing, but placed it carefully beside her sleeping area, tucked between the logs of the wall. 2 days later, a smooth river stone appeared in the same spot on the table. John Smith had already left for his morning hunt when she discovered it. Perfectly oval, with bands of gray and white that reminded her of clouds before snow. Mary ran her thumb over its polished surface, wondering how long he had carried it, how many times his calloused fingers had worried its edges before deciding to leave it for her. The gifts continued. A carved wooden wolf, no larger than her palm, its features rendered with surprising tenderness, by hands more accustomed to skinning knives and axe handles. Mary arranged these treasures on the small shelf near her bedding, a growing collection of silent conversations. She understood their language. In a world where words had been used to condemn her, to strip away her dignity and her husband's land, these wordless offerings spoke volumes. Each was John's way of acknowledging her presence, not as burden or payment, but as someone worthy of notice. One afternoon, as Mary mended a torn shirt of his, a half-forgotten melody rose to her lips. The tune was something her mother had sung while kneading bread, a simple, winding song about spring returning after winter's grip. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it filled the cabin with something that had been absent for too long. She didn't hear the trapper return. Only when the door hinges creaked did she realize John stood there, a brace of rabbits in his hand, frozen in the threshold. His winter blue eyes held a look she couldn't decipher, something between wonder and memory. The song died in her throat. For a heartbeat, they existed in perfect stillness. The moments stretched between them like a fragile thread. Then John nodded, a barely perceptible movement, and continued with his tasks as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. That evening, as they ate in their customary silence, Mary noticed how his gaze occasionally drifted to her shelf of treasures, then back to her face. The air between them had changed, charged with unspoken possibilities. When she finally slept that night, Mary dreamed not of branding irons or jeering faces, but of blue feathers falling like snow, and a melody that promised spring would come again. Mary felt something shifting within her as the days passed. It wasn't just the mountain air clearing her lungs, or the distance from town healing her spirit. It was the quiet reclaiming of herself, piece by fragmented piece. One morning, while John Smith was out checking his traps, she discovered a pile of his clothing tucked beside his sleeping area. His shirts were torn at the seams, frayed at the cuffs, bearing witness to a life lived through harsh elements. Without hesitation, Mary gathered them into her lap, fingers tracing each tear with purpose. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box near the hearth. The familiar weight of the needle between her fingers brought back memories of evenings spent by candlelight in her former home, before Robert Davis had stripped everything away. Each stitch she placed in John's garments was deliberate, a small act of gratitude for the shelter he'd provided. The cabin itself began to transform under her care. Mary swept the stone hearth until it gleamed in the firelight, scrubbed the wooden table until the grain stood proud. She arranged John's tools with precision, creating order from the functional chaos he'd lived in for so long. The trapper never commented on these changes, but she noticed how his eyes lingered on the newly organized space, how his shoulders seemed to carry less weight. But nighttime brought unwelcome visitors. Mary would jolt awake, her body drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of the branding iron searing her skin anew. In her dreams, the townsfolk circled her, their faces twisted in righteous hatred as they marked her as an outcast. She would wake gasping, disoriented in the darkness. On those nights, she would find John already awake, sitting upright on his bedroll, a silent sentinel. He never approached, never touched her, but his presence was an anchor. The mountain man would simply wait, his blue eyes reflecting the dying embers, keeping watch until her breathing steadied and the tremors subsided. One particularly brutal night, after the nightmare had released its grip, Mary whispered, "Thank you," into the darkness. John nodded once, the barest dip of his chin. No words passed between them, but something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer merely two damaged souls sharing space. They were becoming something else entirely, something neither had dared name. By day, they continued their silent dance of survival. Mary mended while John hunted. She cooked while he chopped wood. But beneath this routine, a foundation was forming, built of small kindnesses, unspoken understanding, and the gradual healing that comes when two broken people recognize in each other the possibility of becoming whole. The cabin creaked against the night wind as Mary Johnson curled beneath her blanket. Sleep had become a fragile thing since her banishment, but here, in the mountain refuge, it came easier each night. The fire's glow painted shadows across the rough-hewn walls, and John's steady breathing from his bedroll near the door had become a strange comfort. A sudden cry shattered the silence. Mary bolted upright, heart hammering against her ribs. Across the room, John thrashed in his sleep, his massive frame twisting beneath his furs. "Susan," he called out, voice raw with anguish. "Susan, run!" The mountain man's face, usually impassive as stone, was contorted in grief. His scarred hands clutched at nothing, reaching for ghosts only he could see. Mary froze, uncertain whether to wake him from his nightmare or allow him this private communion with his pain. "The boy," John moaned. "Michael." The names hung in the air like smoke. Mary's chest tightened as she realized she was witnessing the breaking of a dam. Emotions the silent trapper had walled away for who knew how long. She understood too well the weight of such memories. Her own nightmares still brought the searing pain of the branding iron, the jeering faces of the townsfolk who had turned on her. When John finally stilled, falling back into exhausted slumber, Mary remained awake, keeping vigil until dawn painted the small window with pale light. She had thought him untouched by tragedy, a man of the wilderness, separate from human suffering. Now she recognized a kindred spirit, another soul carved hollow by loss. Morning brought no mention of the night's revelations. John rose with the sun as always, his face once again unreadable as he prepared to check his traps. But as Mary moved to stoke the fire, something caught her eye, a small wooden carving perched on the stone mantel, previously hidden behind his hunting knife. The figurine depicted a woman cradling an infant, the details softened by years of handling. One finger had worn the wood smooth where John had traced the woman's face again and again. Mary didn't touch it, but stood transfixed, understanding blooming like a winter flower. They were two ghosts sharing the same shelter, each haunted by different fires, her by betrayal and injustice, him by a loss so profound it had driven him to this desolate peak. As Mary prepared their morning meal, she felt something shift between them. Not quite trust, not yet understanding, but recognition. In this cabin at the edge of the world, two broken souls had found an uneasy peace in their shared solitude. A week later, John Smith discovered a set of fresh boot prints circling the cabin, their pattern deliberate and searching, just beyond where the pines stood sentinel. The tracks weren't those of a wandering trapper or lost traveler. They moved with purpose, stopping at windows, lingering where shadows would hide a man watching. The mountain man studied them carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing as he crouched in the snow. Measuring the depth and stride with his calloused fingers, these weren't the prints of someone seeking shelter or trade. They belonged to someone who wanted something or someone. When he returned inside, Mary looked up from the pot she was stirring, the question dying on her lips as she sought his expression. John's face had set like stone, his blue eyes hard as glacier ice. He moved past her without a word, but his silence carried a weight she'd learned to read. "Someone was here," she said. Not a question. The trapper nodded once, hanging his fur-lined coat on a peg by the door. His movements were controlled, deliberate, but Mary caught the tension in his shoulders. She'd grown attuned to his body language over their weeks together, learning to interpret what he wouldn't say. A new heaviness filled the cabin, displacing the fragile peace they'd built. John retrieved his axe from beside the hearth, running his thumb along its edge with practiced precision. The firelight caught on the metal, revealing nicks and scars from years of use, not just for splitting wood, but for protection. Mary watched as he gathered supplies, lengths of cord, metal traps, small bells that would sound an alarm if disturbed. His hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for danger before. "Robert?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John paused, considering, then gave a slight nod. It was the most logical conclusion. Her brother-in-law had invested too much in his lie to let her disappear. The land he'd stolen through false accusations would never truly be his while she lived to tell the truth. As darkness fell, the mountain man worked methodically, setting traps along likely approach routes, checking sightlines from windows, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood survival depended on preparation. Mary followed his lead, gathering what weapons they had, positioning them for quick access. Neither spoke of what the boot prints meant, but both knew. Their isolation had been discovered. The sanctuary of silence they'd built together now faced a threat from the world Mary had been cast out of, a world that rarely forgave those who escaped its judgment. That night, the wind carried whispers through the trees, and somewhere in the darkness, wolves howled a warning. The night air hung heavy with foreboding as John Smith placed the skinning knife into Mary Johnson's palm. The blade gleamed in the firelight, its worn handle smooth from years of use. His calloused fingers lingered briefly over hers, a silent acknowledgement of the trust between them. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice rough from disuse. "Bar the door no matter what." His winter blue eyes held hers, conveying more than his sparse words could express. Mary nodded, her fingers tightening around the knife. She had learned to read the mountain man's expressions, to understand the gravity in the set of his jaw. The cabin that had once been her prison now felt like the only safe place in the world. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John merely shook his head, moving to check the rifle that hung above the hearth. He worked methodically, loading the firearm with practiced efficiency. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a mournful warning that matched the tension in the trapper's movements. That night, Mary slept fitfully, the knife tucked beneath her pillow. She woke at every creak of the timber walls, every whistle of wind through the cracks. John remained vigilant by the window, a dark silhouette against the moonlit snow, watching the tree line with predatory focus. Dawn broke with deceptive tranquility. The mountain was painted in soft pinks and golds, the snow glittering like scattered diamonds. Mary had just stoked the fire when a sharp knock rattled the door. John motioned for her to stay back, his hand moving to the axe leaning against the wall. He approached the door cautiously, shoulders tensed for confrontation. On the threshold stood an old trapper, his beard frosted with ice, face lined with worry beneath his fur cap. Mary recognized him as one of the few who occasionally traded with John, a man who respected the boundaries of the mountain. "They're coming for her," the visitor warned without preamble, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Her brother-in-law's got the preacher with him, saying you stole her by force." John's expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw working silently. "They're gathering men from town," the old man continued, glancing nervously at Mary. "Robert Davis is spinning tales about witchcraft and abduction. The preacher's whipping them into a frenzy." Mary felt the blood drain from her face. The brand on her wrist seemed to burn anew at the mention of her brother-in-law. Robert would never stop until he had what he wanted, her husband's land, free and clear, with no surviving claim. "When?" John asked, the single word weighted with deadly purpose. "Tomorrow, maybe sooner," the trapper replied. "Thought you ought to know." John nodded once, pressing a package of dried venison into the old man's hands before closing the door. His eyes met Mary's across the room, and in them she saw not fear, but resolve. John Smith reached into his leather pouch and pulled out several strips of dried venison. The old trapper accepted the payment with a grateful nod, tucking the meat into his worn satchel. No words were exchanged about the value of the warning. In the mountains, such debts were understood. As the elderly man disappeared into the trees, John turned back toward the cabin. His weathered face had hardened into granite, jaw set with determination. The cabin, once merely a shelter, had become something worth defending. Not just walls and a roof, but what dwelled within. Mary Johnson stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the warm glow of the hearth fire. The mountain man noticed something different about her posture, no longer hunched with fear, but straight-backed and resolute. The weeks in the wilderness had transformed her, stripping away the town's shame and revealing steel beneath. "They'll come at nightfall," John said, his voice rough from disuse. "Robert knows these woods well enough." Mary stepped forward, meeting his gaze directly. "There's a ravine to the west," she said, her voice steady for the first time since her arrival. "That's the only way to approach without being seen. My brother-in-law used it once to ambush a deer. He'll use it again." John's winter blue eyes widened slightly. He studied her face, searching for uncertainty, but finding none. A flicker of respect passed through his expression, something new and significant between them. "Show me," he replied simply. Together they moved to the western edge of the clearing. Mary pointed toward a natural depression in the land, where the snow lay deeper between two rocky outcroppings. The trapper nodded, understanding the tactical advantage it offered attackers. "We'll set traps there," he decided. "And here." His calloused finger indicated several approach points. They worked through the afternoon, John constructing deadfalls while Mary gathered materials. She surprised him with her knowledge of knots, skills learned from her late husband. When she suggested using pine sap to make the rope less visible against the snow, the mountain man gave her an approving glance. As dusk approached, they returned to the cabin to prepare its defenses. John checked his axe edge, testing its weight in his hand. Mary watched him, then spoke words that changed everything between them. "I won't hide inside while you face them alone." The trapper paused, studying her with new eyes. She was no longer the broken woman Robert had dragged through the snow, a debt to be paid. She stood before him as an equal, a survivor. He nodded, understanding. She was not just a charge, but a comrade. The twilight painted the snow in shades of violet as four silhouettes emerged from the tree line. Robert Davis led the procession, his face contorted with a mixture of greed and righteous indignation. Behind him came the town preacher, clutching an iron cross so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Two men from town, the blacksmith and a farmhand, flanked them, rifles slung over their shoulders. "Come out, demon," the preacher shrieked, his voice carrying across the clearing. He thrust the cross forward as if it were a shield. "Return this woman to her rightful family. You've bewitched her with mountain magic." Mary Johnson peered through a crack in the shutters, her heart hammering against her ribs. She caught John's eye across the cabin. The mountain man nodded once, his weathered face betraying nothing as he slipped out the back door like a shadow. Robert gestured to the blacksmith, pointing toward the western edge of the clearing. "Circle around through the ravine," he whispered. "The wolf won't expect us from that direction." The two men moved with the confidence of hunters who believed their prey was cornered. They descended into the ravine, snow crunching beneath their boots. In their arrogance, they never noticed the thin wire stretched between two pines, nor the carefully balanced logs suspended above. The blacksmith's foot caught the tripwire. There was a moment of perfect stillness before the mechanism released. Logs thundered down in a cascade of wood and ice. A horrifying scream tore through the dusk as the farmhand disappeared beneath the deadfall. The blacksmith stumbled backward, terror replacing his earlier bravado. "Thomas!" he cried out, but his companion only moaned from beneath the pile. Robert spun toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. The preacher began to pray loudly, his words tumbling over one another in panic. "This is the devil's work," the religious man shouted, backing toward the trees. "God protect us from this mountain demon." From the shadows of the pines, John watched, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The trap had worked exactly as planned. Mary's knowledge of the ravine had proven invaluable, her transformation from victim to strategist now complete. The blacksmith dragged his injured friend from beneath the logs, both men now effectively removed from the fight. Only Robert and the preacher remained standing, their confidence shattered by this first demonstration of the mountain's defense. John's fingers tightened around the handle of his axe. The real battle was about to begin. From the shadows, John Smith emerged like a specter, his massive frame silhouetted against the snow-laden pines. Gone was the quiet mountain man who carved wooden figures by firelight. In his place stood a warrior, eyes burning with a cold fury that matched the Colorado winter surrounding them. The broad axe in his hands wasn't just a tool anymore. It was an extension of his rage, of years spent in solitude nursing wounds deeper than flesh. The attackers hesitated, momentarily frozen by the sight of him. They had expected a recluse, easy prey. What they found was a force of nature. John moved with surprising speed for such a large man, using the terrain he knew intimately. He kicked up blinding sprays of snow, disappeared behind tree trunks, only to emerge where least expected. The mountain itself seemed to fight alongside him, offering concealment one moment and solid ground to launch attacks the next. One of Robert's men lunged forward with a hunting knife. John sidestepped, bringing the flat of his axe down on the man's knee with a sickening crack. Bone shattered beneath the impact. The attacker collapsed, howling in agony as he clutched his ruined joint, his screams echoing across the clearing. The second man, witnessing his companion's fate, backed away in terror. His boots slipped on ice as he turned to flee, abandoning any pretense of loyalty to Robert Davis. The woods swallowed him, his panicked breathing fading into the distance as he crashed through underbrush. Only Robert and the preacher remained now, standing their ground, but visibly shaken. The brother-in-law's face twisted with a mixture of hatred and fear, while the religious leader clutched his iron cross so tightly his knuckles whitened. They trembled, not just from the bitter cold, but from the realization that their righteous mission had transformed into something far more dangerous. "Devil's work," the preacher spat, voice quavering despite his attempt at authority. "The Lord will—" John cut him off with a single step forward, axe gleaming in the fading light. The preacher's words died in his throat. Robert's eyes darted between John, the injured man moaning in the snow, and the dark path where his other ally had disappeared. The calculation was clear on his face, weighing greed against survival, hatred against fear. "You think you've won?" Robert snarled, but his bravado couldn't mask his terror. "She's mine by right. My brother's property passed to me." John remained silent, his stance unwavering. In this moment, he was truly the wolf of the mountain, patient, dangerous, and utterly committed to protecting what was his. The crack of the pistol echoed through the mountain air, shattering the tense silence. John Smith's body jerked backward as the bullet tore into his shoulder, blood immediately darkening his worn fur coat. Pain flashed across his weathered face, but he made no sound, a man accustomed to suffering in silence. Robert Davis smiled, a cruel twist of lips that revealed more about the darkness in his soul than any confession could. "Not so mighty now, are you, wolf?" he taunted, advancing through the snow with renewed confidence. The firearm still aimed at John's chest. The mountain man braced himself against a towering pine, his broad axe gripped firmly despite the blood now streaming down his arm. His blue eyes, cold as the winter sky, never left Robert's face. Even wounded, John remained dangerous, a predator backed into a corner. "The land was never yours to take," Robert spat, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "And neither was she." His finger tightened on the trigger, the preacher watching from a distance, prayers falling from trembling lips. John shifted his weight, calculating his chances. The trapper had survived worse than a shoulder wound, had endured losses that would have broken lesser men. This mountain had taught him patience, when to strike and when to wait. As if sensing the balance of power shifting, the forest around them grew unnaturally still. The wind died. The creaking of snow-laden branches ceased. Then came a sound, soft at first, barely perceptible, the gentle crunch of paws on snow. From between the trees, yellow eyes appeared, floating like lanterns in the gathering dusk. One by one they emerged, massive timber wolves, their silver-gray coats blending with the twilight, moving with the fluid grace of shadows. Robert's confidence faltered as he realized they were surrounded. 7 wolves materialized from the forest, forming a protective semicircle behind John, their breath steaming in the cold air. At their center stood the alpha, larger than the others, with a distinctive white patch across its chest. "What devil's work is this?" the preacher whispered, his iron cross clutched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The wolves made no move to attack, but their message was clear. These mountains had chosen their guardian, and it was not the men from town. The alpha wolf padded forward to stand beside John, its shoulder nearly reaching the man's hip, a silent declaration of allegiance. Robert's hand trembled now, the pistol wavering between John and the wolves. For years, townsfolk had whispered about the Wolf of the Mountain, but none had understood the truth of the name until this moment. John's eyes met the Alpha's, a look of understanding passing between man and beast, two predators united against a common threat. The mountain had rendered its judgment. Mary stepped into the firelight, her shadow stretching tall against the trees. The knife in her hand caught the glow, but it was the strength in her eyes that commanded attention. Without hesitation, she rolled up her sleeve and thrust forward her arm, displaying the raw, ugly brand that Robert had seared into her flesh. "You did this," she declared, her voice carrying across the clearing with a power she'd thought lost forever. "For a lie. To steal my husband's land. The sin was yours, Robert, not mine." The preacher's prayers faltered, his lips moving soundlessly as the truth hung in the air between them. Robert Davis stood frozen, the pistol still aimed at John, but his face drained of color as Mary continued. "You told everyone I was unfaithful, that I couldn't bear children. You branded me a sinner to turn the town against me," she said, each word sharp as the blade she held. "All to claim what my husband left me." The religious man stumbled backward, his iron cross hanging uselessly at his side. The certainty that had fueled his righteous anger crumbled as he looked from Mary to Robert, seeing the lie for what it was. John Smith stood bleeding but unbowed, one hand pressed against his wounded shoulder. The mountain man who had lived in silence for so long finally found his voice, rough from disuse but clear in the night air. "I know what men like you do," he said, his eyes fixed on Robert. "They burned my home, took my wife, Susan, and my son, Michael." The names hung in the air, sacred things long unspoken. John's shoulders straightened, as if unburdened. The ghosts of his past finally acknowledged after years of silent grief. "All for land," he continued, "just like you." The wolves moved closer, their silver coats gleaming in the moonlight. The Alpha's yellow eyes seemed to hold judgment as the pack circled, not attacking, but herding, containing the threat. They moved with purpose, as if understanding the human drama unfolding before them. Robert's hand trembled, the weapon suddenly heavy with the weight of his exposed crimes. The preacher's face contorted with shame as the realization of his complicity washed over him. Mary stood tall between the men who had tried to destroy her and the man who had saved her. The brand on her wrist was no longer a mark of shame, but evidence of survival. The mountain had taught her strength, and John had shown her that silence could hold healing as well as pain. The wolves' low growls vibrated through the clearing, nature itself passing sentence on those who had twisted truth for gain. Robert Davis's pistol fell to the snow with a dull thud, his fingers trembling as he stared at the wolves surrounding them. The preacher collapsed to his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks as prayers turned to desperate pleas. The pack moved with eerie coordination, herding the men down the mountain path, away from the cabin, away from their greed and lies. Their howls echoed through the trees, not threats, but a declaration. This territory was protected, this sanctuary inviolable. When silence finally returned to the mountain, it felt clean, absolute, like the first snowfall of winter. Inside the cabin, Mary Johnson worked by firelight, her hands steady as she cleaned John's wound. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed bone, a painful reminder of mortality, but not a death sentence. The trapper sat still as stone, only the occasional tightening around his eyes betraying his discomfort. "You should have let me help," she whispered, pressing a poultice of pine resin and herbs against the torn flesh. John's weathered face softened. "You did," he answered, his voice still rough from disuse. "You stood your ground." As she wrapped his shoulder in clean linen, Mary realized how completely their roles had reversed. The protector now protected, the rescued becoming rescuer. By the hearth that had witnessed their silent communion for months, they found something neither had dared name: sanctuary. Not in grand declarations or promises, but in the simple acts of care, in survival shared, in trust hard-won. That night, John took her hand across the table, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. No words passed between them. None were needed. Spring came, then summer, autumn, winter again. The seasons turned, healing more than just flesh. A year later, a garden bloomed where only snow had been. Mary coaxed life from the mountain soil, carrots, potatoes, herbs that perfumed the air. John built a fence to keep deer at bay, his shoulder long healed, but the scar a permanent reminder of what they'd faced together. Laughter, once foreign to these walls, now echoed through expanded rooms. The cabin grew as they did, adding space for new beginnings. The carved figures of Susan and Michael remained on the mantel, honored ghosts no longer haunting but watching over. The wolves still came sometimes, keeping their distance but acknowledging the strange pack that had formed in their territory. The old trapper visited with news and supplies, marveling at the transformation. Together, Mary and John built something neither had thought possible after such loss. Not a family of sons, as the mountain man had once been mockingly offered, but a home of peace. Their legacy wasn't carved in bloodlines, but in the heart of the wild itself, in second chances, in a love as resilient and enduring as the mountain that sheltered them.